Show. Okay, so first of all, Elizabeth, thanks for the invitation to talk today. I've been a plant pathologist actually for almost 40 years as part of my career working on diseases primarily of wheat and barley and other things here in the Palouse, especially things in the soil. But really my experience in gardening and diseases really came at the Pullman Community Garden. So I'll just show a few slides. I see there are some members of the community garden on the slides today. This is a real resource. So if any of you would like to garden, if you don't have the ability to do it, if you live in an apartment or whatever, feel free to look us up and look for a plot. So this garden has been around for over 25 years. We're right on the floodplain of the South Fork of the Palouse. This just shows an aerial shot of where we are, and we have about 100 plots, mostly 20 by 20, but some 10 by 10. And this year with COVID, we've had more gardeners than we ever have. It has really taken off as we'd expected it would. Same thing happened in 2008. We actually broke out a lot of new plots because of the increased demand. And we've been able to stay open the whole time. Of course, you can socially distance in a community garden like this. But we have a storage shed here. We've got a picnic structure, a little greenhouse, and a parking lot. So it's a nice place to garden and also kind of like a nature reserve. We've got lots of wildlife, bees, pollinators. And in fact, we have some projects with the Palouse Conservation District this year with a grant. It may not show up on this slide here, but they put in a pollinator garden here with some shrubs, native shrubs, and some demonstration signs, etc. So that's part of our ongoing education. Just showing a few slides of gardeners out there in the spring getting their hands dirty. Some pictures of some of the produce that we have. And our big event, had it happen this year, of course it didn't because of COVID, is our spring fair and plant sale. And this is where we have community groups such as the Palouse Conservation District and others talk about gardening, the environment, science, excuse me. And then we also have our plant sale. Also people like Master Gardeners, Leta, Master Gardeners, others. So this would have been a big event. We're trying to figure out how to do this next year. Probably we will not be able to do it in person. We're thinking of maybe some kind of socially distanced plant sale. And Elizabeth and I were thinking of some ideas on how to do some education around some of the things that normally would have happened at the spring fair. So that's just kind of a little preview. And again, go onto our website. We redesigned this year if anybody's interested in that. So what I'd like to do is just spend a little bit of time talking about plant diseases and my experience in many, many years of gardening. So I'll talk about general concepts, what causes plant disease, and then a lot of pictures of what the symptoms look like, because that's how we really decide as a plant pathologist what the possible diseases are, and then spend the rest of the time on how to control diseases in the garden without using pesticides. And the thing I forgot to mention is Koppel Pullman Community Garden is all organic. Okay, we stipulate that in our contract. We do not use any pesticides, fungicides, or insecticides in the garden, so it's all managed organically. So a disease, as you can imagine, I think everybody knows what disease is. This is a definition I took from our textbook. Basically anything that causes a deviation in the growth of the plant. Important thing here is symptoms, and also from an agricultural point of view, impairs the quality, quantity, and economic value. And of course, a lot of the plant pathology discipline really focuses in on the agricultural industry because those are the people that have a real stake in protecting their investment and providing a good food resource. So when we talk about diseases, we can think of non-biological things, and we also classify these as diseases. So for example, the environment can be too hot or too cold, too wet or too dry. You know, just like people, plants have an environment that they're optimum in. Not enough light, too much light. Nutrient deficiencies are a lot of things that cause problems with plants, or sometimes even too much of an element, or even chemical damage from pesticides or air pollution, etc. So then when we talk about the biological causes of disease, I listed the 4 microorganisms here that cause 99% of the plant disease. And I listed them in order of their importance by how big I made the type font here. So in fact, fungi are probably the major focus of most of the research. And then after that would be viruses, and then bacteria, and then nematodes. And I could contrast this with humans, especially now. You know, viruses and bacteria are the bulk of the organisms that cause diseases in humans and animals. But there are fungi which can attack humans and animals, not as many of them, but very, very difficult to control. We just do not have the antibiotics and means of controlling. So fungal diseases can be very, very devastating in humans, especially those that are immunocompromised. So finally, before I show some examples, we have this concept where we say that a disease can only occur if you have three things happening at the same time. First of all, you need the pathogen, and it has to be virulent, so it has to have the ability of attacking the plant. You've got to have an environment where the conditions are favorable for the disease. And the important thing to remember about fungi and bacteria, not only do they have a narrow range of temperatures they can grow at, but they really depend on wet conditions or free water on the surface. So bacteria, both bacteria and fungi, if they don't have free water or near 100% relative humidity on the surface, they just dry up and they don't infect. And then finally, you need a host that is susceptible to attack. So when you have all those three things happening, you have disease. Now, this is important when we think about disease control, because if I alter one of these, the disease won't occur. So for example, if I use a resistant host, no disease. If I try to change the environment in my garden, no disease. So again, just a quick look at those four groups. The fungi, microscopic, they form these network of hyphae in the soil, which are kind of like the way that the fungus absorbs the nutrients from the soil or from the plant. We've all seen an example of this in our refrigerator with a moldy bread or pear. When you see that fuzzy growth, that's actually an amalgamation of all of these hyphae. This is what they look like as a close-up. And of course, these hyphae then grow through the soil and then attack the plant and then grow into the plant and then can spread around. And the interesting thing about the fungi is that they produce these spores, which are kind of like their seeds. And these can be spread in the wind, spread in the rain. And in fact, this is the way we used to identify fungi when I first started my career, but now we use DNA techniques. But there were whole people would spend a whole career trying to identify these things under the microscope. Then we have bacteria, much smaller than fungi, much more primitive, single-celled. This is a very big close-up of a bacteria. So evolved, of course, much earlier than fungi or plants. And you can also grow these in petri dishes. Each one of these probably composed of millions and millions of bacterial spores or bacterial cells. So we can grow those. Then the nematodes, these are actually animals. They're microscopic. They look like worms, although they're not truly worms, but they have a digestive system, a nervous system, circulatory system, reproductive system. So they're actually very complex little animals, but they're in the soil. And they will then swim over to the root, and then they've got this little feeding structure here called a stylet, which will actually penetrate into the root cell and suck the contents out, kind of like an aphid. And then viruses. And of course, we've probably got more education about viruses these last few months than most of us ever have. And the interesting thing about viruses, they're not really organisms per se. They can't live on their own. They've got to get inside a living cell, and then they basically hijack the biological machinery in the cell to make more copies of themselves. And they're either composed of DNA or RNA, which carries that genetic code, and then usually it's surrounded by some kind of protective protein. Now, in the case of the COVID virus, the coronavirus, we've all seen those pictures with the spike proteins on them. Very, very small. You can't even see them with a microscope because they're smaller than the wavelength of light. So we've got special microscopes that we use to look at them. But the most interesting thing about these is they're all vectored by insects in the case of plants. So they've got to get into the cell somehow. And the way they do that is they get into insects like aphids, mites, leafhoppers that feed on the plant, and they essentially inject the virus into the plant. So all of our viruses pretty much, or most of them, have to be vectored by an insect. And that's a picture of one of the more common ones called tobacco mosaic. And again, you can see this core of the DNA surrounded by these coat proteins. And this is actually a picture under an electron microscope, which we can visualize these things. So that's kind of a quick overview of the causal agents. And what I want to do now is just go through some of the main diseases that we encounter in the garden, what they look like, and then I'll end up with talking about some methods to control them. So I first of all start out by diseases in the soil, and this is what I've specialized in. And these are really hard to diagnose. And that's because everything's happening below ground on the roots. And above ground, you see symptoms that are not very characteristic. They could look like nutrient deficiency. They could look yellow. They could look stunted. They could look wilted. And you've got to actually go down and dig the roots up and look at them and see what the cause is. And these are mainly caused by fungi and nematodes. So here's some examples. So these are some seeds that were planted in the soil and rotted and may not have even come up. So we see this a lot in the springtime if we plant seeds early when the soil is too wet or too cold, and then you go and dig it up and see why they didn't come up, and then you see something like this. Or maybe they do come up and they grow for a week or two and then they die. So this is what we call post-emergence damping off. And then if we look at the root system, the root systems on a healthy plant should look nice and white. And if you see this brown discoloration or black discoloration on the root, that's an indication that a fungus or a nematode is eating away at them. And so here I show some examples of roots that are rotted. And sometimes that rot will move up into the lower stem. We can often see that. Here's some pictures actually of lentils that look like they had some kind of root rot. Okay, then the next one is wilts. And wilts is where the plant looks like it hasn't been watered. We all know what wilts look like, but in fact, there's plenty of water in the soil. And this is caused by fungi that get into the vascular system and essentially plug it up. And if you cut the stem, you can see a picture here of the discoloration in the vascular system. Here's another picture. Here's some peppers that are wilted. Here's some zucchini, squash that are showing wilt. And so again, they just cannot take up enough water, and then they wilt. And sometimes it looks like you have kind of this browning of the foliage or leaves curling up and die. So maybe the plant doesn't look like it's completely wilted, but you see parts of it where the leaves have just turned brown. So here's some wilts on tomato that we can see here. So again, primarily fungi, a few bacterial diseases can cause wilt, but again, it's mostly starting out in the root, growing up into the vascular system, and then plugging it up. Okay, then we have blights, and blights are diseases that attack the foliage so quickly it just turns brown and dies. And this is a good example here, fire blight. We see a lot of this on apples, pears, members of the Rosaceae family. And basically this is a bacterium that gets into the, at the time of flowering, it's vectored by bees, and then you'll have the whole end of the stem turn blighted. Here's another example on potatoes. This is called late blight. This is the disease that caused the Irish potato famine in the 1840s and led to mass starvation and half the population of Ireland, the survivors, moving to the US. So that had huge social and cultural implications. And so there we can see that one just very quickly killing the potatoes. And we also have late blight on tomatoes, but it's not as common here because it's too dry. Then we have these leaf spots. which are really easy to recognize. The fungus, or in some cases the bacteria, simply infects the plant and then grows out in a circle. And sometimes it'll kill the tissue around it, and then it will produce spores that can then splash and infect further plants. There's another example of some leaf spots. Then we have these rust. I'm interested in rust because this is probably a major disease on wheat. It causes this orange coloration. And this is an obligate parasite. So this is an interesting organism. Most of the fungi we have can either grow on living plants or dead plants. And once the plant is dead, then they can really go to town. These guys have to have living cells in order to infect. So they will not kill the plant outright, but they'll keep the plant alive so that they can suck the nutrients out of it. But they do reduce yield and cause other damage. And then powdery mildews is a similar one. That's mainly on the surface of the leaves. Doesn't kill the plant, but just if you have enough powdery mildew, it'll stop you won't have much photosynthetic area. And that one can also easily be spread. And then we have this whole class of interesting organisms, which I really call these like plant cancers. They're knots, galls, or tumors. And essentially what the pathogen does is it programs the cells to divide uncontrollably or to grow uncontrollably. So we've got a lot of examples of bacteria and fungi which cause the plant to form these galls or knots. And then finally the viruses. And the viruses mostly cause weird looking leaves and distortion where you'll have patches of dark green and light green. We call this a mosaic. The leaves will be curled up and distorted. Here you can see commonly see this on zucchini where you have patches of lighter and darker. And again, most of these are vectored by insects. And if you have a severe infection, can really affect the production. And then finally, tuber and fruit rots. And these are the fungi that get into the developing fruit, usually early on in the season. And then after you harvest and store the commodity, you have these rots that will move throughout the tomato or the potato or whatever. Okay, so that's kind of your quick plant pathology course, I guess, to cover all the things that I mostly see in the garden. So what I'd like to do now is spend a little bit of time talking about how to control diseases without pesticides. Now, of course, we realize that the agricultural industry, because of their economics and everything, have to use pesticides to control many of these diseases, or they wouldn't have a crop. So their whole livelihood depends on it. Our whole food source depends on it. So, but when we talk about gardens, if we lose a plant here and there, we're not going to lose our livelihood. And so there's a certain amount of diseases, kind of things we can tolerate. But there's also, because we're working on such a small scale, a lot of things that we could do that a commercial grower could never do. And not to say that commercial growers do not rely on a lot of these same similar things to control their diseases, especially when we talk about plant resistance, because they don't want to spend money on fungicides. They don't want to damage the environment. So a lot of these concepts I'm talking about also apply to them. But the first thing is keeping the plants nourished and healthy. And this is, in the case of our garden down at Koppel, we use organic sources of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. I use things like compost, fish emulsion, manure, bone meal. There's lots of things, organic sources of fertilizer that you can buy. But the basic principle is keep the plants healthy and they'll be more resistant to disease. And this also is making sure that the pH is optimum, that the plants are not too drought stressed or too wet. I would say people tend more on the too wet side than they do the drought stress. That's one thing we work with growers down at Koppel every year, because we want to conserve water, is show them how to keep the plants happy without overwatering them. So that's the first thing. Second thing is resistance. And this, I would say, is probably the most important for commercial growers, and you can also use it. And the idea behind this is that plants have natural resistance. They've been co-evolving with these fungi and bacteria for millions of years, and they've developed defenses. And then, of course, the pathogen develops a way of overcoming it. So it's kind of like an arms race. But, you know, and of course, we've domesticated these plants for the last few thousand years. And plant breeders try to identify these resistant sources, often in the wild types, and then move them into the plant. And that's what we've done with rust on wheat, for example. And the reason it's so neat is because there's no cost to the growers. Okay, you just buy the seed, they're resistant. That's all you need to do. You don't need to spend money on spraying or anything else. So that's the number one thing. And in fact, you can buy, look in your seed catalogs, and you can identify, for example, tomatoes that have these letters here, which indicate resistance to this one, verticillium, fusarium, nematodes. And in fact, I just got my first seed catalog of the year. This is about the time when I start getting deluged by these. In fact, I went through and looked, you know, this catalog has lots of tomatoes, and they've got, if you look at the tomatoes, they've got all sorts of varieties that have incorporated a lot of this resistance into it. So that's, I think, the key thing to develop or to use is if certain crops like tomatoes, pepper, some of the others, they've really done a good job of breeding resistance into them, not everything. Then the next thing I say is crop rotation. And this is something that our growers around here have used for 100 years. You'll notice that they don't grow the same thing in the field year after year. They rotate with peas or with chickpeas. And the idea behind this, if you grow the same thing year after year, the pathogen keeps building up. If I put a crop in there one year that the pathogen can't eat, its population is going to go down. It's got to wait out a year until another susceptible crop is put in. And this is really good for soil-borne pathogens because they don't really move around. They're stuck in the soil at the same time. Don't plant in the same location every year, mix things up. A lot of people practice intercropping where they'll plant different things all together. You know, this was the traditional cropping system of the Native Americans with squash, beans, and corn. And the main thing is that the diversity reduces the development of diseases as opposed to monocropping, you know, hundreds of square miles of the same thing. And in fact, this is why I've often thought in our community garden, plant diseases for the most part are not the major problem. You know, we have more problems with, number one, weeds, and we have insects. And I've often thought it's because we have such a diversity of things there. You never build up one thing all at once. Then we have these cultural methods. And this is ways of avoiding the disease. For example, a lot of things, it's recommended that the soil be warmed up to a certain temperature before you plant in the spring. If you plant when the soil's cold, they grow very slowly, and it gives the fungi a chance to attack them. I often, for example, peas, since we don't use chemical seed treatments in the garden, a lot of times when I plant peas, they will just get rotted out. So what I figured out was I could germinate them in my house in vermiculite, grow them up for a week or so, and then transplant them into the field. And I completely get around that seed rot problem. Now, it's a lot of work, but that's about the only way that I can get a good crop of peas. Don't overwater. Both fungi and bacteria need free water on the surface to infect the leaves. So if you overhead water a lot, you'll provide an avenue for those things to infect. Don't plant too close together so you have good air movement so things dry up a lot easier. Another thing is to start with disease-free plants. And I had a problem with this year. I think some of the tomato plants and basil plants, like well, tomato plants for sure had a disease called botrytis, gray rot, which is a problem under wet, cool conditions. And we had cool conditions this spring. So I did lose some tomatoes. Use certified tested seed, especially in the case of seed-borne pathogens. Now, there's some pathogens that are transmitted by seed, and those are the ones that the seed catalogs will say we tested them and made sure that they don't have infection in the seed. Another thing is culling out diseased plants. You can just pull them out so it doesn't spread if you see a diseased plant. And I would recommend not putting them on the compost pile because they can produce resistant structures that survive composting. Now, theoretically, composting on the commercial scale is done thermophilically. So when you buy compost commercially, they put them out in these big windrows and they heat up from bacterial activity to a very high temperature, and that kills the things in the compost pile. But most of us that do this composting, my pile never heats up. I just don't manage it that way. Improve soil health, and this is important. Put a lot of organic matter in the soil like compost. We've had a vegetable compost in our backyard for 20 years. We put all of our waste out there. We've got worms, manure, straw, etc. So anything you can do to improve the soil health with organic matter, which then improves the soil structure, how quickly it drains, etc. Now I put this one here, and I see that there's, in fact, I think Tammy was on the list here. Her and her husband are long-time no-tillers. So this is something that the growers have really tried to cut back on because of the soil erosion. And the same thing with the garden. I try to avoid rototilling. I don't think I've rototilled my garden in about 15 years. So I just manage the weeds by shoveling the plot in the spring, because rototilling will destroy the soil structure and also destroy the earthworms. So if you can do it without rototilling, I'd recommend that. Again, you have to put a little bit more elbow grease into it. Cover crops, a lot more people are doing this, planting something like a pea crop or something during the winter to keep the soil covered. And then growing legumes that fix nitrogen, like peas and beans, are always a good thing. And then there's some products out there that are actually registered as organic products that you can use for disease control. Baking soda for powdery mildews, compost teas, neem oil, and mineral oil. And then also for insects, I'm not going to talk about insects today, but diatomaceous earth is a pretty good product to manage some insects, or plant soaps or mineral oils. So you can also manage insects in your garden with organic sources. And then there's actually other organisms that you can use to control the bad organisms. And we call this biological control. And there's products out on the market. Some of these are bacteria, like the first two. This one here is a fungus. And the idea behind those is that they will parasitize or antagonize the pathogen. Use a lot of these in greenhouse production, high value crops. This has really taken off the last 20 years. And then insects, especially in greenhouses, same way. They've developed parasites, parasitoids, ladybugs, entomopathogenic fungi, and nematodes. So a whole list of products, and you can actually buy those on from the web also. So that's kind of my quick overview, but I would like to point out some resources. The Master Gardeners of Whitman and Latah County are a great resource. The WSU and U of I have extension bulletins, which you can look up, which are free. And in fact, there's a Pacific Northwest Disease Handbook. Maybe I'll put that in the chat when I'm finished here, that has lots of things in it. And we did have a WSU plant disease clinic, which was really going strong for about 3 or 4 years. In fact, we used to invite her every year to the spring fair. Unfortunately, she's leaving. And we're hoping to try to fill that position, so stay tuned. So that was another resource that people could use. So with that, that's a sign. That's a mural that was painted by Pat Seiler, a very well-known artist here in the community. And you may have also seen his work on the mural by the Thomas Hammer in the Pine Street Plaza. So he's actually one of our gardeners. And his thing is milkweeds. He's converted 2 or 3 of his plots over to milkweeds to try and encourage pollinators in the garden. So anyhow, I'll leave it with that. And those are some of the connections for Koppel Gardens. You can just Google it and find our website on the web. We've got a Facebook group. We've got an email. So with that, I think I will.
We're also on Twitter.
Oh, there's and Barbara. We've got we have a number of members of the garden that look like they joined. Barbara, Megan, see Ann Ramelli, and others that are avid gardeners. So with that, I will. I don't know how you want to handle the questions.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. That was very interesting. So we do have one question in the chat. If you all are interested, you're more than welcome to turn on your videos, unmute yourself if you'd rather ask this in person, just to make it feel more like a discussion. You're more than welcome to. We have one question. Can you explain the application method of baking soda for treating powdery mildew?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look. You can find a lot of things on the web, but I basically think the idea behind the powdery mildews is that because they're on the surface of the leaf and they really don't get inside, they're easy to treat with something like baking soda. So yeah, I would say just look on the web to find out how to apply that.
Perfect, yes. And then we did have quite a few questions that were sent in when you all registered, and Tim was very kind enough to answer all of those ahead of time. So those are being entered into the chat right now. So if you did submit a question prior, you will see that answer popping up. But does anyone else have a question right now that they'd like to ask? All right.
So I'll ask them. I'll ask everybody a question. You know, what's your biggest disease problem that you find in the garden? Or do you have a lot of disease problems? No, nobody wants to admit.
I have
Powdery mildew.
Someone says.
Yeah.
I have
wilt.
a lot of aphids, and I think I planted my peas too closely together, and I think a little bit of powdery mildew probably exasperated in the lack of airflow in the peas. So
Yeah, aphids. Yep. And aphids are one of those things too that you can buy mineral oil. A lot of times you can just squirt them off with water if they're really a big problem. That's what I've done on the roses in the past, just squirted them off.
I'm fighting fungus attacks on dahlia tubers after I plant them.
Oh, yeah, I saw that question. So after you plant them.
I get what I call dahlia collapse, where it just goes dry and goes wilted.
Yeah.
I checked with the Puget Sound Dahlia Association, and I actually sent a sample into the plant clinic, and they found Fusarium and Pyethium, I think is the way you pronounce it. And I'm trying to figure out a strategy for attacking it without moving my dahlias to somewhere else.
Yeah, I guess the question that I would have, in other words, are you storing roots that already have infection? And then when you're putting them back out in the spring, so is it coming from the infected roots already, or do you think it's in the soil?
I believe it's in the soil. I'm very careful with how I harvested the tubers. I actually dipped them last year, and I lost quite a few over the winter due to a rot because I tried a different type of storage media. But this year I was very careful. I sterilized all my tools between each plant that I separated. And so next year I'm trying to figure out what to do in my dahlia plots to keep from having the issue again. And the first thing I know I got to do is adjust the soil pH. So I'm investigating how to adjust the soil pH.
Yeah, and I mean certainly increasing organic matter, because when you increase organic matter, you increase microbial activity, and basically there's more things that compete with the pathogenic fungi. You know, I don't know if it's also a drainage problem. Are they getting too wet, or, you know, yeah, I've never grown dahlias before, but I know there's a big organization on the West Coast, or on the West Side, that, yeah. Let's see.
Awesome. It looks like Janet has problems with nematodes in her radishes.
Nematodes and radishes. So what does the symptom look like? Is it like stubby roots, or what does it look like?
Okay. The little tunnels on the.
Okay. Those aren't nematodes. Those are insects. Yeah, because nematodes, you would never really, they're so small, you would never really see their tunnels. So that's probably some kind of insect, probably. Crucifers get a lot of, I forget what they're called, root borers or things like that can actually burrow into the. So in that case, you know, maybe, I don't know whether diatomaceous earth would work, or, yeah, because flea beetles are another one. Actually, the brassicas have a whole host of insect problems, and a lot of times people get around those by covering them with like a white cloth to keep the cabbage moths and things from landing on them and causing problems.
So these are insects which have come from the
soil.
air or up above?
Well, either up above, yeah.
Do I put the diatomaceous earth, do I dig it in before I plant the seeds, or do I sprinkle it on the side?
You know, I'd have to look up on that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think another talk we'll have to have as an entomologist.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, I could suggest a few, David Crowder, or it would be one of them at WSU.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Paulitz, for that wonderful presentation. If anyone has any further questions, you're welcome to drop them into the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to share my screen again in just a moment. If you're interested in hearing more from Dr. Paulitz, he was a guest on the Palouse Pulse podcast through PCD. You can find that on our website as well. He talks about helpful fungi, noxious pests on wheat crops, and the importance of community gardens. So if you're interested in that, the link is in our chat.